Hello and welcome to Hill Dickinson's presentation in partnership with Arete Zero Carbon Limited on ESG and the supply chain. I'm Beth Bradley, a partner in the Marine Business Group at Hill Dickinson, and I'm delighted to be joined today by colleagues from across our main business areas, together with Dr. Stephen Finnegan of Arete and the University of Liverpool. ESG, while a relatively new term, pulls together and expands upon several threads of corporate responsibility. Today, our focus is on decarbonisation, an important element of the E in ESG. Following the IPCC report in the summer, and more recently COP26, decarbonisation is high on the business agenda and of tremendous importance if the pace of climate change is to be ameliorated. Decarbonising the supply chain is a challenge, but an urgent one. As we will demonstrate today, pressure to decarbonise is coming from many different directions: regulatory measures at international and national levels, finance and insurance initiatives, as well as counterparty, customer and employee demand. Knowing where and how to start unpicking these issues in order to put in place policies to effect positive change is in itself a big challenge, and one which today's webinar will explore. In terms of order, Jaspal Sekun, a corporate partner, will begin the presentation by setting the scene in terms of ESG and the factors pushing it up the corporate agenda. Dr. Finnegan will then take us through a case study of a business which is seeking to understand its carbon footprint and that of its supply chain, and what short, medium and long-term measures can be taken to reduce it. Jamie Foster, a partner in health, will pick up on the case study and outline the procurement requirements operating in the health sector. Caroline Bridge will follow, a legal director and barrister in our cargo and logistics team, who will then focus on how to use contract to ensure that a business is decarbonising its supply chain, as well as its own practices. And we'll finish with Rachel Hoyland, a senior associate in the shipping team, who will outline the challenges faced by the maritime sector. In terms of housekeeping, there are a number of points on this slide, but we'd be most grateful if you could keep your mics and videos set to off. The webinar will be recorded, and we ask that any questions are submitted in the text box. We ought to have time at the end of the webinar to answer questions which have been put in the text box, but if not, we'll collate the questions and we'll be in touch following the event. Without further ado, I have great pleasure in passing you over to Jaspal, who will formally open the webinar.
Thank you very much, Beth. Sorry about that, just trying to take control of the slides. Thank you, Beth. I suspect most of our audience already knows about ESG, given that you've signed up to an event about decarbonisation. However, I will just spend a few minutes to give everyone a brief reminder of what ESG is, what the key drivers are in this important area, and to provide some context for the topics that our speakers will be covering today. So ESG has risen in importance in recent years to dominate the corporate agenda, and it's now moved very much into the mainstream. I've included on that slide a few recent examples of news headlines, and it seems every day there's a dizzying number of new articles and headlines on this topic. What is ESG? ESG is an acronym which stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, and it's an umbrella term capturing a broad range of factors against which companies, investors and stakeholders can assess the performance of particular entities. However, ESG also has broader application. The overarching concept of ESG investing is a shift in emphasis from short-term profit maximization as the primary objective of corporations towards a more long-term sustainable business model where significant weight is given to a range of ESG factors such as the environment, employees, the supply chain and the wider community. So the table on that slide shows some of the common factors that are relevant to each of those three pillars, turning to each of them. So the E, environmental, focuses on a company's impact on the environment and its ability to mitigate risks of environmental harm. Today's webinar will be focusing mostly on the environmental pillar, particularly reducing carbon emissions and climate change as we transition to a net zero economy. But it's worth noting that the other two pillars are also important. So the S, social, considers how a company's operations and policies impact on its workforce, on communities, on other businesses, and society as a whole. The G, governance, examines a company's internal affairs and the relationship between the key stakeholders, and obviously incorporates corporate governance. So why is ESG important? Well, a key driver is the ever-increasing requirement for companies having to report on their ESG performance. Initially, this was largely a matter of voluntary disclosure under non-mandatory frameworks. However, there's been a much greater focus from governments and regulators around the world on mandatory ESG reporting standards. So sticking with the environmental pillar of ESG, many countries have set ambitious environmental and climate change targets. For example, the UK government has committed to become a net zero economy by 2050. And a key factor in meeting those targets is ensuring that investment is directed towards companies with appropriate environmental credentials. And to achieve that, there's a much greater focus on regulatory and legislative measures to provide greater clarity around disclosures. And those regulations are coming in thick and fast. So another factor driving the rise of ESG investing, driving ESG is the increase in ESG investing with the creation of ESG benchmarks and indices, and an increasing shift from passive to active investing, and the creation of ESG funds, which have attracted record inflows of capital. And just to contextualize this, Deloitte have estimated that ESG mandated assets could make up half of all professionally managed investments by 2025, totaling some $35 trillion. And consequently, more investors than ever screening companies for ESG criteria when making their investment decisions. So strong ESG performance is therefore increasingly becoming a material factor influencing asset valuations and investment decisions. And indeed, it's increasingly becoming a non-discretionary item with respect to accessing capital. Sticking with the investment theme, there's a much greater, there's increasing academic evidence to suggest a link between strong ESG performance and higher investment returns. Similarly, additionally, I should say, there's a range of other stakeholders who are also driving the ESG agenda. For example, employees and consumers are increasingly requiring businesses to transform their ESG performance. And finally, ESG shareholder activism is also increasing. You may have seen a few days ago, Bluebell Capital Partners, an investor in Glencore, came out very vocally demanding that Glencore drop thermal coal from their portfolio, and described it as morally unacceptable that they were proposing to keep it in the portfolio until 2050. And there's also been a rise in ESG related litigation, and the number of environmental or climate cases being filed against corporations is on the rise. You may have seen, for example, in the US, the Oakley Group was the subject of class action lawsuits after the company allegedly made false statements regarding its greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption. So in summary, those companies that don't take steps to implement good ESG performance face a number of risks, including reduced access to capital, reduced longer-term operational and financial performance, reduced shareholder returns, reputational damage, and employee and stakeholder dissatisfaction. So I just want to expand slightly on the ESG disclosure and reporting requirements, as that's one of the key drivers. There's a huge number of frameworks that have been developed for companies to utilize in their reporting or in their strategy development. I've included on that slide some of the more widely adopted voluntary frameworks. However, it's mandatory reporting frameworks that are now becoming more widespread. In the UK, we've already had some mandatory requirements, which I've listed on that slide. However, it's important to note that many jurisdictions around the world have also introduced and continue to introduce their own mandatory reporting requirements, and not all of them are consistent with each other, which brings its own challenges. And I want to mention the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, because that underpins much of the UK's approach to ESG reporting. And the TCFD is a body established a few years ago by the Financial Stability Board. Their recommendations have been quite widely endorsed around the world, and it's a reporting framework which is designed to provide useful forward-looking information on how financial risks and opportunities are being addressed by companies, and it sets out a framework for the content of reporting, and particularly in relation to climate-related issues and quantitative disclosure of specific metrics and targets. So currently, only companies with a premium listing on the London Stock Exchange must make, comply or explain disclosures in their annual reports in relation to the Tcfd recommendations. However, the government intends to phase in these requirements for all companies by 2025. And as part of the next phase of implementation, the government recently published proposals to expand the scope of mandatory disclosures to publicly quoted companies, including AIM companies, large private companies and LLPs. There are some qualifying criteria, including having to have over 500 employees and or a turnover over 500 million, depending on the type of business. And those new measures will take effect from the 6th of April 2022. There are some sector-specific requirements which are also emerging. My colleague Jamie Foster will talk about rules that apply in the context of public procurement, but there are many other sectors where this is increasingly becoming a theme. So, what are the key themes and challenges? I mean, given the importance of ESG, companies can't simply afford to treat this as a box ticking or window dressing exercise. Instead, companies should be developing their ESG policies and procedures and factoring ESG criteria into their decision-making processes and procedures across all levels of the business and, crucially, the supply chain. That's often the area where it can have the biggest impact, and that's the focus of today's session. It's fair to say the ESG landscape is constantly changing, often with a piecemeal approach, and there's a multitude of voluntary and increasingly mandatory reporting requirements. And there's a lack of standardization, which means that companies face a daunting task to navigate through those different standards and effectively prioritize issues that are material and relevant to their businesses. One of the features of the ESG world that we live in now is about data management, and it's one of the most important tools in all of this, and reliable data in particular. Investors increasingly want to see companies measure ESG data, and ESG providers can in turn then extrapolate that data from annual reports and the like and generate ESG ratings. However, given the lack of standardized reporting and data collection standards, there are challenges around the quality, consistency and reliability of ESG data. There's also an issue around lack of resourcing and expertise. Not all businesses will have the same level of financial and operational resources and sophisticated data collection systems that larger businesses have. So a number of businesses may therefore need to rely on support from external ESG consultants like Arete and third-party data collection tools. There's a temptation to think of this as a long-term issue, particularly given the long net zero targets that some companies and countries have set. But actually, it's a short-term issue because a lot of the decisions and actions need to be put in place as soon as possible in order to meet those targets. And finally, in terms of in addition to integrating ESG into business models, cultures, and strategies, a key component is being able to effectively communicate an ESG policy with an authentic narrative to your stakeholders and effectively help companies stand out amongst their peers. So just finally, I want to talk about green and sustainable finance. I've talked about the pressure on corporates, but in recent years, there's also been greater accountability imposed on financial institutions in respect of their own sustainability performance. And consequently, there's been a trend towards green or sustainability-linked bonds, loans, and derivatives. And from the borrower's perspective, these types of products could reduce their cost of borrowing and also provide access to a larger pool of lenders and investors. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of those in detail, but in a nutshell, green bonds and green loans are instruments where the borrower uses the proceeds for a specific green purpose or project, whereas sustainability-linked loans incentivize borrowers to reduce their own environmental impact. But it's fair to say the size of these markets are growing significantly. In 2020, ESG bond volumes reached a record high of $489 billion, compared with $250 billion in the previous year. So yeah, it's an important area. So that concludes my section, and I'll now hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Finnegan, who will take you through our case study. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Jasper, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today to discuss net zero carbon, and thanks to Beth and the Hill Dickinson team for inviting me along today. So I've got a very brief presentation which is mainly focused on a case study approach to achieving net zero carbon. So just before we start, and by way of an introduction, as was mentioned, my name is Steve Finnegan. So I have two distinct roles at present. One is that I am an academic at the University of Liverpool, which is my main role really. I'm a lecturer in sustainability, and I'm the managing director of what's called the Zero Carbon Research Institute. And in a private capacity, I'm also the managing director of an organisation called Arete Zero Carbon. And it's through that organisation that I wish to speak today. The main focus and purpose of that company is to help companies to achieve net zero carbon. So ultimately, what is net zero carbon, and what experience do I have in this space? Well, I've been working for 25 years now in this area of energy sustainability, carbon management, and a lot of the schemes that Jasper referred to earlier, I've been involved with, things like SCCR, ESOS, and many other things. Now, you'll see on this screen, this is a list of companies that I've worked with or for or consulted with in the general energy and sustainability field. So just by way of example, I spent 3 years at KPMG. I was a consultant at Ernst & Young. I've been involved in projects with the US Department of Energy and numerous others as well. So KFC, for example, lots of other projects and sort of companies that I've sort of worked with really. So I've got a lot of sort of knowledge in this space and a lot of experience through the years. So what is net zero carbon, and what do the government require all business to do with this? So by 2050, pretty much every business in the UK has to achieve net zero carbon, and there's actually a definition there on the bottom left of the screen, which actually defines what net zero is. So this will affect every business, whether it's a listed business or a SME. And as Jasper referred to earlier, there are certain mandatory and voluntary schemes depending upon the status of your business. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment with SMEs who are obviously non-listed businesses who are about to IPO or about to list in the future. And we're also working with some really big organisations who are listed businesses who want to achieve net zero carbon as well. And also there's a number of reasons why a business wants to achieve net zero. That could be purely environmental, it could be profit driven, it could be because they're required to do so legally to achieve certain frameworks or tenders. So how do we actually achieve net zero carbon? Well, the way in which we do this, and Jasper again referred to it earlier, is around ESG. And what we're focusing on today is the environmental of ESG. Now, the process you need to follow is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the document you see on the screen there on the left. Now, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was written in 2001 and was revised and updated in 2004. There's been some extra updates recently, but it's still, quite an old document really, and it has been around for a number of years. Now, within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it very neatly defines how to measure carbon, and it measures carbon through 3 scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And Scope 1 is a company's gas natural gas use and use of company vehicles. Scope 2 is electricity that you buy for your business. And Scope 3 fits under 15 different categories and is essentially your entire supply chain. So the question is, how do we apply the greenhouse gas protocol to your business? You know, how do we go through these various Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 challenges and changes? Well, the way in which we do this is that we start with a supply chain map. And what we're going to do now, just to finish the presentation really, is to look at a fictitious case study. Now, in this case study, we have a set of laptops being procured for the NHS. So we need to look at individual case studies and say, how do we apply the greenhouse gas protocol to that particular business? And that's the challenge. And again, Jasper referred to it earlier. What we found is that it's all about data, really, all about data management and data availability. So how do we start? Well, the first thing we do is we will map a business, and we'll map the supply chain of a business. So in this particular example, we have laptops made in factories in China. They are then shipped across to the UK. They are then freight forwarded onto a distribution centre. They are then forwarded through an outbound third-party logistics business, and they are then used and sold to a customer or a consumer. Then there's an end-of-life element too. So there's obviously, you can imagine, for some companies, there's quite extensive supply chains. For others, that could be limited to the UK position. But the first thing you need to do is map your entire supply chain and make it quite graphic and make it quite user-friendly so that it makes perfect sense. The next part is to then apply the greenhouse gas protocol to your supply chain. So what is the carbon footprint at the end of life? What's the carbon footprint for freight forwarding? What's the carbon footprint for manufacturing within factories and transportation and so on? Now, for this case study under Scope 1, 2 and 3, what we find is that Scope 1, again, gas and company vehicles, is next to zero. Scope 2, electricity, is very small, but the whole picture is dominated by that Scope 3, that sort of supply chain impact. And what we found over the years is that probably 80 to 90% of a business's carbon footprint is in that Scope 3, is in the supply chain. So it's at this point that we could start to look at setting targets. Well, okay, can we get Scope 1 and 2 down to zero by 2023? But how do we challenge Scope 3? So that's the elephant in the room, really, is this Scope 3 impact. So how do we break this down, this Scope 3? Well, what we can do is then go back to the 15 different categories and say, well, in this example, purchasing goods and services, which is category 1, gives us our greatest carbon footprint. Transportation and distribution is the third, and second is end of life. So we can start to break down this, this huge area into 4 main areas of concern for our business, and that can be represented as a simple pie charts and bar charts. Now, the software tool that we use is called Power BI, so Power Business Intelligence. So we'll provide, as part of our studies, we will break down the information and provide this using Power BI. So we can then say, okay, well, if this category 1 is our highest carbon footprint, then what can we do to reduce that carbon footprint? Well, we need to identify which of the factories that we purchase from have the highest impact. Now, that could be because we buy the most products, or it could actually be because that factory is more inefficient than this factory, for example. So we can start to break that down, identify in more detail what the footprints are. In this scenario, we could say, well, what if we were able to recycle 100% of our products on the right-hand side? Or what if we were not able to recycle any products? And we can scenario test where we would be if we were able to look at the end of life treatment of products. And then for our transportation, does half of the product travel by air freight and half by sea freight? Now, we know that air freight is much more damaging from a carbon perspective than air freight or rail, for example. So obviously we can look at that and say, well, look, can we change the way we procure goods, supply goods? What can we do with the shipping companies, aviation companies? And then we can then develop a plan. So our plan says, well, this is our carbon footprint given a particular year. And we then have certain steps that we can put in place, and we can target those steps and give them a time-bound target to achieve net zero. And so in conclusion, really, what's the main 6 things that we found, having worked with numerous businesses to achieve net zero? Well, the first thing is all about data. It's all about data management and data presentation. For every company we work with, that's the most difficult aspect of our work, is having the data available and the knowledge and intelligence around that data. The next is that you can make big inroads with contracts and procurement. So the way in which you are contracting with companies, the way in which you're procuring goods and services, you may be a small company but have large supply chains, and you can change the way you contract and procure and have a positive global impact. Resourcing, you need to resource this in-house. So most companies now, if they don't have a head of ESG, they are looking to appoint someone in that space. And that person, the company needs to take ownership of this. It's okay having consultants to start the journey, but it has to be resourced internally. Collaboration is absolutely key. So for you to collaborate with your supply chain partners, with your networks, and that's where the real bonus lies in achieving net zero. Jasper referred to this earlier, transparency. So being transparent with your data, how you set your system boundaries, what you're responsible for, what someone else is responsible for, that's absolutely key. And the final thing to mention is reporting. So being able to report this, and by following a net zero carbon plan and target using the greenhouse gas protocol, you are ready for every single piece of legislation moving forward. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for your time, and I will now pass you on to Jamie Foster. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be able to speak to you. My name's Jamie Foster. I'm a partner in the Health Business Group here at Hill Dickinson. And just to follow on from what Jasper and Stephen have been saying, I'm going to take a sector-specific look at ESG and the supply chain, with a particular focus on the environmental aspect of this and what it means for the healthcare supply chain. At the outset, it's worth saying that healthcare systems are large contributors of carbon emissions. So it's generally thought that about 4.5% of global carbon emissions are from healthcare systems. And the same is true here in the UK, where about 4.5 to 5% of emissions are from the NHS alone. The NHS has 1.3 million employees. And you can see how it can be such a big contributor. And that's one of the key aims of the government's net zero strategy, is around helping the NHS and healthcare systems to play a significant part in reducing emissions. So the NHS is leading the way in many ways. It dominates healthcare in this country, as I'm sure everybody on this call will know. They've been tracking their carbon emissions since about 2008, but have really started looking at this in a bit more earnest in the last couple of years. The NHS long-term plan, which came out in 2019, referred to something called a triple aim, which has a particular focus on sustainable and efficient use of resources. And that's now been or is being enshrined into the new draft Health and Care Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. It's interesting that there's no express requirement around getting to net zero, but there are some broad duties that will make it clear to NHS organisations that they have to focus on this. And some of you may have seen what's called the Greener NHS programme, which is a flagship programme put in place last year, backed up by the main document, Delivering a Net Zero Health Service, which is all about how the NHS achieves this. The NHS, to Stephen's point about resourcing, has a Chief Sustainability Officer now, Dr. Nick Watts, and has developed a comprehensive supplier roadmap. So about 60% of the NHS carbon emissions are from the supply chain. So there is understandably a big focus on looking at that supply chain to help achieve the target. There are various other contractual requirements coming in, which we'll talk about shortly. But I think the main message is, the NHS wants to beat the overall UK target and aim to become the first net zero health service in the world by 2045. Worth saying that they've already made some interesting starts on this. So a hospital in Wolverhampton in the Midlands has developed or is developing its own solar farm so that it can source all its energy needs from renewable sources. Guy's and St Thomas's in London, where I am, has changed its supply chain arrangement so that medical supplies arrive at a hub in Dartford and are then moved to the hospital sites up the Thames. And then when they reach the hospitals, go by bike overland to the hospitals themselves. So simple but effective things like that are sending out strong messages across the NHS about how things can be changed. So one of the things that the NHS and indeed the government are clear that they need to do is use public procurement as leverage to deliver net zero. So I think about the net zero strategy, Build Back Greener, which came out in October this year, highlights that about £292 billion worth of government contracts were awarded, and the government clearly sees that as a very important way of building towards net zero. This is not new. There have been a range of initiatives around for at least 10 years now around social value, which feeds into things like environmental considerations, decarbonisation. But recent procurement law, public procurement law in particular, is taking a very prescriptive approach on this. So there is now a requirement in government contracts for 10% of the evaluation criteria to be based on social value, and that's going to be brought into the NHS from next year. And significantly, direction this year around the requirement for government bodies to take account of carbon reduction plans when procuring major government contracts. So at the moment, that's contracts over £5 million. So this has all been emphasised again in the government's green paper on transforming public procurement. Their response to the consultation came out this week, and it's clear that this is going to be the direction of travel. So the bottom line is, if you want to bid for government contracts, you're going to need to be able to demonstrate that you can deliver social value and that you have carbon reduction plans and that you're able to deliver on them and track progress. So very clear direction of travel that needs to be taken account of. More specifically in the NHS, if you are taking Stephen's example, a supplier of laptops into the NHS, you're going to have to take account of the roadmap. All of this is publicly available, of course. And from April 2023, the starting point is that all suppliers for contract value over 5 million will be required to publish carbon reduction plans for the direct emissions. And then that builds over the course of the decade up to 2030, when suppliers will only be able to qualify for NHS contracts if they can demonstrate progress through published progress reports and continued carbon emissions reporting through the supplier framework. Some latitude there for SMEs, but if anything, this agenda is going to accelerate rather than slow down. So all suppliers to the NHS, whatever they're supplying, laptops, clinical supplies, anything, need to be aware of this roadmap. And if you are supplying clinical services to the NHS, then things become even more onerous, because the NHS Standard Contract, which is a nationally mandated contract, now includes specific clauses and requirements about taking reasonable steps to minimise impact on the environment, deliver green plans, provide summaries, nominate net zero leads, and start to purchase all electricity from renewable sources. So you can see that there's already a lot happening in the NHS and the healthcare system in the UK, which in very practical terms means that businesses supplying into the NHS need to take account of these things from now. And that's the end of my slide. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Caroline Bridge, who's going to talk about decarbonising your supply chain.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caroline Bridge. I'm a legal director and barrister in our marine business group. I specialise in advising businesses involved in the buying and selling and moving of goods internationally on their supply contracts. So in this session, I'm going to give you some practical guidance on how your decarbonisation strategy can be extended to your supply chain contracts, and hopefully also demonstrate why it's important to do so. So as Stephen has demonstrated, the size of a company is not directly reflected by the size of the impact its supply chain can have. The latter can be significantly larger. As Stephen, I think, said, it can account for up to 80 or 90% even of a company's carbon footprint. So what this means is that you can be doing everything right in terms of your business, but it's essential to get your suppliers on board if you're going to achieve your own milestones for being carbon neutral. And also from a wider ethical perspective, if you're going to drive essential change that all businesses need to deliver, not forgetting as well the commercial and legal risks that Jaspal outlined in our first session this afternoon. So what can we do in order to drive this change? Well, a key part of the strategic solution to this from a legal perspective lies in the contractual framework of your relationship with your suppliers. In other words, that means imposing the right legal obligations on your suppliers in order to drive the necessary change and implement the necessary actions. So we're talking here specifically about what your business needs from its suppliers, as opposed to generic regulatory compliance, although that's also important. But here we're looking about actually achieving specific changes that you need to meet your milestones. And that leads to three key questions. Question one, where are the obligations going to be set out between you and your supplier? So literally, where do we put them? Where do we document them? Question two is, what do we actually need those obligations to say? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that these are meaningful? How do we ensure that the suppliers will comply with them? So let's pick up on that first question. Where are the obligations set out? And I've summed this up in three potential options here. The first, in an ideal world, would be to have a bespoke contract between you and your supplier. So by that I mean a specifically tailored contractual document. It's been expressly negotiated to deal with the commercial and operational reality of your relationship. It's been executed by both parties, and it's in clear written form so that both parties know exactly where they stand. I emphasise the words in an ideal world because we know this isn't always realistic to achieve, but that's your gold standard that you should be working to if you want to make sure that you're imposing specific obligations on your suppliers and making sure that they are enforceable. After that, at option two, I've mentioned standard trading conditions. So this can be practical in some ways because it gives you an opportunity to make sure that you can at least get certain principles across if you're incorporating your standard trading conditions into your purchase contracts with your suppliers, whether those are for the supply of services or the supply of goods. I say it's practical, but only to a degree, because there are two potential pitfalls that need to be taken into account. The first is making sure that your standard trading conditions are definitely incorporated into your contract of purchase with your supplier, and not and that means making sure that they've been notified properly to your supplier, and also that their terms and conditions don't take precedence over yours, what's often referred to as battle of the forms. The other pitfall that's specific to what we're talking about this afternoon is making sure you get the necessary degree of specific obligations into your trading conditions, and that can be difficult to do if you're looking to do that with your general terms and conditions, but you need to impose specific obligations on different suppliers. So you can see again why having a bespoke contract is still the gold standard, it's still preferable. The third option, and I say options with quotes around it because they're not really options, as I will explain, is to do nothing. And that could encompass doing literally nothing at all, or even taking a more laid back approach and relying on ad hoc requests or correspondence, perhaps mentioning it in an email or in a meeting, but not actually going far enough to build it into your contractual framework with your supplier. This isn't really an option if you want to drive change, because if you haven't got it there built into your contractual framework, you're not going to be able to monitor progress. You're not going to be able to enforce compliance as well. So I'd urge you not to fall into the trap of doing nothing and hoping for the best, because the change won't be driven if requirements aren't imposed through the contractual framework. So having decided that you're going to make sure that the specific obligations are included in your contract, what do we actually need them to say? I'll split this up here into two categories. The first are the active obligations. So that's spelling out exactly what you need the supplier to do, or equally importantly, not to do, to enable you to meet your decarbonisation objectives. And of equal importance are reporting obligations. So that's making sure that the supplier provides you with the data that you need both to monitor compliance and make sure that change is happening, and to enable you to comply with your own reporting obligations as well. The key to both of these areas is making sure that the obligations are specific and they are clear. Jasper mentioned in his session about avoiding greenwashing, box checking, window dressing. This is equally important when it comes to your contracts. General or very vague ESG clauses are basically where the parties refer to being green, refer to collaboration between them, but aren't specifically enforceable, are not going to achieve the change that will be needed to achieve net zero. And to give you an example of what I mean by this, this is, I should add, a fictitious sample clause, which says the supplier acknowledges that the customer has a desire to achieve goals in relation to the environment and will act in good faith to reduce its impact on the environment in providing the goods, or it could be in performing the services, and will endeavour to collaborate with the customer and comply with the customer's reasonable requirements, requests for information and corporate policies in this regard. The spirit of this clause is entirely commendable. It's encouraging collaboration between the parties, which is very important. But from a legal perspective, in terms of enforcing a party's contractual obligations, it isn't going to be enough, because it doesn't enable the customer to monitor compliance. And as Jamie has talked about in looking at the Nhs Standard Contract, it doesn't enable the customer to make sure that they can enforce the obligations either. I think the key message here is that platitudes in a contract aren't going to drive change. Even provisions that say suppliers warrant and represent that they will be green in their approaches aren't going to be enough unless they've got a specific obligation to comply with a specific standard. So the key message here is to be clear and be specific. So, for example, the supplier shall ensure that no more than, for example, 5% of shipments in any one contract year should be moved by air. So going back to the example that Steve was talking about, where air can represent a significant impact on the carbon footprint, by actually having a measurable target for your supplier, that in itself can drive lasting change. It might alternatively be a restriction on the type of products that are used in the manufacturing process. And similarly with reporting requirements, actually spelling out what information the supplier needs to provide and spelling out the frequency and perhaps even the format in which that needs to be provided. So a simple obligation requiring the supplier to provide such information as the customer may require won't always be enough. It's necessary and desirable to be as specific as you can be to make sure that you can retain control and drive the change. And that brings us to the third and perhaps most important question, which is ensuring that the suppliers comply with the objectives that you impose upon them. We mustn't forget in this context that your suppliers are for profit. So it's important, therefore, as the customer in your supply chain to make sure that your suppliers value the ESG objectives that you're setting. And that means focusing on what the suppliers care about. So when it comes to volumes, making sure that their performance might be linked, for example, to whether or not they will get the volumes of work that they're looking for. So non-performance might result in a reduction of contractual volumes. Tying in termination provisions to their compliance, or alternatively imposing a service credit regime. So that means having specific service levels that are tied in to your ESG objectives and resulting in particular remedies or service credits if they don't comply. Or you could really get them on what's most important to them, which is allowing for provisions that enable you to delay or withhold payment, which will, in most cases, get their attention and hopefully force them to value the importance of the obligations that you're imposing. And the key message as well is to make sure that those performance metrics are clearly defined again. If there is a standard to be met, then that will enable change to be driven in order for you to achieve your ESG goals. And that may in turn require a cultural shift within your own business. So typically such metrics will focus around issues such as delivery time, conformance of products and services to requirements, and cost goals. So it's important that these are also taken into account when you're setting your ESG goals, to make sure that your ESG goals also have a primary importance in assessing your metrics that you're imposing in your supply chain. So to sum up, there's obviously a balancing act to be struck when you're negotiating contracts in your supply chain. Commercial leverage is a counterforce that can't be ignored. The aim has, however, to be to drive your suppliers to integrate the ESG objectives into their day-to-day operations. And that means customers need to be bold in their demands. They need to aim high in order to drive innovation in their supply chain. And it might also mean focusing strategically on your key perpetrators, as Steve was looking at, so that the message comes through that if you want our business, you've got to have ESG integrated into your business. And again, the time that for this to be commenced is now. It can't be at some undefined time in the future. It's something we expect to see from day one of our contract with you. So I hope that gives you an idea of the sort of steps that can be taken in your contracts, in your supply chain. And I'd now like to introduce my colleague Rachel Hoyland, who's going to be speaking about decarbonisation in shipping. Thanks, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much, Caroline. I'm just going to take control of the slides. So I'm Rachel Hoyland. I'm a shipping lawyer and senior associate at Hill Dickinson, and one of my areas of expertise is decarbonisation of shipping. Now, Stephen and Caroline have made the point really strongly that if supply chains are going to, if organisations are going to meet ESG objectives, decarbonisation of their supply chains is really important. Now, if supply chains are going to be decarbonised, that means that shipping needs to be decarbonised, and that is because 90% of global trade is moved by sea, which means that almost all supply chains include ships. Now, shipping, as has been mentioned already, is already the most efficient mode of transport, more efficient than aviation, road and rail. However, the shipping industry is still responsible for around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So decarbonising shipping is a real opportunity both to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions generally, but also to positively impact almost all supply chains, and through that, the greenhouse gas profiles of many organisations. Now, shipping is a little bit unusual in that it has an international regulator. That's the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. However, the IMO hasn't yet produced rules which will result in zero or even net zero emissions by 2050. It does have some goals, and I've set a couple of key ones out on the slide there. The first in relation to reducing the increasing the efficiency of shipping, and the second in relation to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. But as you can see, they don't take us towards we don't arrive with those at net zero or zero. I'll just speak quickly about the regulations which do go to achieving these goals though. There's a suite of 4, some of which have been in force since 2013. So the EEDI regulations, they relate to the design of ships and they require efficiency to be built in. The SEEMP regulations are all about the operation of the ship, however, so everything from the routing to the cleaning of the hull. Then we've got some new regulation that's coming in from 2023. That's EEXI. That's all about bringing up the efficiency standard of the current existing fleet to a minimum. And also CII, which creates an A to E rating system for ships, very similar to white goods or the one in place for properties. So these are all globally applicable regulations, but what's happening, partly due to the lack of ambition, perhaps one could say, in relation to these regulations, is that other nations and collectives are starting to think about their own separate regulation. So in China, in the US and in the UK, emissions trading schemes for shipping are on the horizon. In the EU, it is very likely that this will be a reality from 2023, and that's pursuant to some detailed proposals that the EU published earlier this year. We've also had some interesting outcomes from the recent COP26, so things like the Global Methane Pledge and the Climate Declaration, which is an agreement to establish green shipping lanes, and that may drive further regionalised regulation of shipping. So what we see is we're starting to get a bit of a patchwork regulatory landscape forming. Now, the market is moving ahead here because that regulatory push to shipping isn't enough to get it where it needs to be at the moment. So the pull is becoming increasingly important, and that pull comes from the financiers, the stakeholders in shipping, and importantly from the customers and the end users. So very recently we have seen the COZEV platform created. That is a kind of collective platform where cargo owners can come together to create a demand signal for green shipping. We've also got the CE Cargo Charter. That's a visibility initiative in the chartering sector, which allows charterers to see and compare the climate alignment of the ships that they're chartering. And there was a similar initiative that preceded that in the finance sector, the Poseidon Principles. And those initiatives effectively enable financiers and charterers, by way of pulling out data on emissions, to start to prefer ships that have the better emissions profiles. So how is shipping responding to what is relatively new scrutiny of its emissions? Well, it is working hard to find ways to become more efficient, and to switch away from fossil fuels and to alternatives like batteries, wind and hydrogen. On the short sea side, so coastal shipping, inland waterways, we see that the technological change is perhaps a little bit more possible, although I would emphasize that it's early days and the technologies here are really still in the emergence and early deployment stage. On the deep sea side, the technological challenges are greater, as are the costs involved. So behavioral change is a really significant tool for the deep sea side of shipping to enable it to improve its efficiency for the time being. Now, decarbonizing shipping is a vast and complicated topic. It's a very diverse industry, and there's only really time here today to give a very high-level summary. If anyone wants to go into more detail in relation to that, I'd be very happy to pick up a conversation later. But if you have attended this webinar thinking about decarbonizing your supply chain and you want to think about shipping in that context, then there are a couple of key messages that I would like to leave you with. Number one is that shipping is trying to become greener. There's a long way to go and there's a limited availability of assets, but the industry, like all industries, is on a journey to decarbonize. Number two, the current regulation, the push to shipping, isn't sufficient to enable it to reach zero or net zero by 2050. So number three, that means that the pull, the market demand element, is a really important enabler for shipping. So if you want access to green ships in the future, I would recommend giving thought now to how you create that demand signal, because the sooner and the clearer it comes, the easier it will be for shipping to adapt. Now, Caroline set out some ideas around how to do that. If you're not sure what kinds of metrics to be thinking about, then a good place to start would be to think about from 2023, requesting ships that are A or B rated according to the CII regulations. You could also think about selecting ships which are early adopters of new technology, and you might think about switching up your supply chain so that you are making use of short sea shipping and inland waterways where there's likely to be more access to green assets, especially in the early part of the journey to decarbonisation. Caroline said already, I think this is a real opportunity for entities along the supply chain to work together, and for entities further along the chain to work with shipping to create the kind of services they would like to have in the future. And that's not just the case for high volume customers, that's really for everybody who's involved in using shipping services. Some ways in which you might think of doing that would be maybe by formalizing a long-term relationship. That's a great way of assisting owners to access finance, which they need to pay for improvements to ships. And you might also think about a really simple thing is accepting or requesting slower sailing times, because that has an immediate and a positive impact on emissions reduction. Now, in the short term, there may, of course, be increases in costs associated with decarbonisation, but supporting shipping to green means that ultimately there should be more choice in the market, which means more options for you at procurement level, and enables you then to better manage costs in the long term, and importantly, to meet your own ESG goals. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Beth for a few concluding remarks and any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks to everybody who's presented on this afternoon's webinar. There is a little time for questions if there are any. I'd be grateful if they could be popped into the text box so that we can field them. But it seems to me, in terms of the overall picture, that it's absolutely clear that the pressure to decarbonise is going only in one direction. And it is something which affects all businesses, no matter whether you are a small business working in the UK economy or a larger business working internationally. The pressures are there both from a regulatory level, but also in terms of the push factors or the pull factors of finance and employee demand and customer and other stakeholders' demand. Now, yesterday I participated in a Maritime London event where ESG was very much a core part of the discussion occurring in terms of what are the big issues and challenges for 2022 for shipping. And I have to say there was not a single person in the room or indeed on the panel who did not view this as being a real and serious issue for maritime to tackle. But it was also very, very clear that while we have regulations, which Rachel has kindly outlined, that the market itself is moving more quickly than the regulators themselves are. And I assume, and we've seen from Jamie and with Jasper, that is very much in evidence, really, across all of the businesses that we represent at Hill Dickinson. And it's also very important to us, and I think it would be remiss of me not to mention that Hill Dickinson are also partnering with Arete to look at our own our own decarbonisation issues, to make sure that we've got the appropriate policies in place, not just to satisfy employee demand and future employee demand, but also to recognise and respond to our own client demand too. Now, I see that there is a question that has arrived. Okay, so the question, and it's a really good one, and I think it sounds very much on some of the issues that Caroline has raised in terms of how to use the contracts or the contractual position to include specific terms to ensure that there are no green or blue washing along the value chain. The questioner has that one of the main challenges is that the actual validation and measuring from different players, it's not really integrated, and I think that's something that Jamie and Jasper did touch on, that quite often there are different levels of initiatives requiring different types of data. So how is that to be managed? From my point of view, I think, and I think Caroline covered it about as well as anybody could, is that if you put into your contracts real measurable targets, together with a requirement for data sharing, for want of a better term, then that is a safeguard that you as a business can have. I don't know, Caroline, if you'd like to jump in there.
No, thanks, Beth. Yeah, absolutely, I'd agree with that. It's the key, without wishing to sort of hammer the same message, is having obligations that are specific, and that means really drilling down into the detail of what you need your suppliers to do. And in some ways that means going back a step before the contract is actually drawn up. So rather than get to the point of contract negotiations and think, right, what do we need in here about ESG, is going back to the exercise that Stephen was talking about and saying, well, look, this is where we've got a real problem. This is where we need to make sure that we are actually getting our suppliers to do certain things. I certainly wouldn't hold myself out in an expert on that side of things. That's very much Stephen's role. But I think the key issue is not thinking about it when you get to the stage of finalising the contract, but actually even potentially when you're going out to tender as well, and making sure it's there from the start. I don't know whether Jamie would have anything to add from a procurement perspective on that.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, I think it's increasingly the contracting authorities, so that the government NHS organisations running the tenders are asking us, you know, thinking themselves, what do we need to put in the tenders? What clauses do we want to require? And there's a balance between being general and being specific. And I don't think there's yet a right answer to that, certainly in the health sector that we're looking at.
Thank you. I see we have another question. I'll just read it. And I wonder whether this is something that Stephen could usefully contribute to. So the question is, how can you be assured that the supply chain delivers what it says without actively applying detailed surveillance on the supply chain? For example, electricity, if it's generated from carbon neutral sources, but also from coal-fired power stations from which all the electricity is fed to a national grid and distributed. You don't know which portion of your electricity is carbon neutral and which portion isn't.
Okay, Beth, I'll try and field an answer for that one. So the best we can hope for at present is when we buy energy in the form of electricity or gas, that we use what's called a REGO approved supplier. So REGO is an acronym, REGO. It stands for Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin. So a number of the suppliers will sell you a REGO approved supply. So that is to state that it is 100% renewable. So every unit of electricity or gas that you use is derived from a renewable source. So that's sort of the best way at present to ensure that we're not buying from the grid. And as Paul mentioned in the question there, if we do buy from the grid, then there will be a mixture of sources: nuclear, solar, gas, and so on. So yeah, so to use that REGO approved supply is probably the best way to go.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Stephen. And I think one of the panelists at the event I was at yesterday was expressing, and it's quite an interesting move in terms of the kind of users of shipping, that many investors are now refusing to invest in businesses or in ships which move coal, for example, or fossil fuel derivatives. So it's not just the industry initiatives where almost like a kite mark you can find a way of being satisfied that, or some reassurance that the energy that you are purchasing is greener, but there are also moves afoot to kind of reduce actually the shipment of coal itself, which is all converging in a very interesting way. Right, we don't have any other questions, and I hope that has answered the last question. Still a little bit of time if anybody does want to get their questions in, but if not, obviously we're all available if you'd like to drop us a line after the event if anything occurs to you. Please feel free to do so. But in the absence of any further questions, thank you very much for your for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you found the webinar useful and interesting, and I hope also that it's given you some directions or ideas for how to start tackling this very, very serious issue. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of my fellow speakers and particularly Dr. Finnegan.